And President Ziegler, Administrator Jeffrey.
I would like to call our work session to order. It's 7:09. And we need a roll call for this.
Sure. Manager Crafton,
She's still connected.
I'll come back. Yeah. Manager Duval. Still connecting. Manager Pedersen,
I'm here.
Manager Cook,
Present.
President Ziegler,
Present.
Manager Duval,
Yes,
present.
present.
Still.
You wish, Mr. President, we can note Manager Crafton present once she arrives, and the minutes can note that.
Okay. I'm okay with that. Administrator Jeffrey, I don't know that I had the agenda. Well, I know I don't have it printed out.
Fine, I will open it up, share my screen, and there is something that I would like to, hold on.
Mr. President, while Administrator Jeffrey is doing that,
Manager Cook?
just as a point of information, we are conducting this work session via Zoom due to the pandemic and out of abundance of caution regarding the pandemic.
Yes, I agree.
All right,
Thank you.
President Ziegler, managers, or you have two items on the agenda for this evening, or two items of discussion, and then project status update. I would like to suggest one thing in light of our prior discussion on hybrid configurations for meeting and the fact that we aren't quite ready to have the Robert's Rule of Order presentation, that we take item number 4, and in that place, I go over the two different quotes and configurations for the managers. I have also emailed that to you, and it should be coming right now, and Staff Bacham is updating the website with that information. If it is okay with the managers, I would like to proceed with that. If not, we can just hold off on that until May as well, whatever you prefer.
So I'll move that we approve the agenda as amended.
All second.
We have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion? Hearing no discussion, can we have a roll call vote, please, Mr. Smith?
Manager Crafton, absent. For the vote, Manager Duval,
Yes,
Manager Cook,
Yes.
Manager Pedersen,
Yes.
President Ziegler.
Yes.
Motion carries 4-0 with Manager Crafton absent.
President Ziegler,
Yes.
managers, if I may, I'd like to introduce Brandon Barnes. I believe most of you should have had some interaction with him in the past. He worked on our Bloomington flood risk assessment mapping. He's been working on the Prairie flood risk assessment mapping for us. Rather than having me muddle through what he has presented, I thought it best to have him actually come and present the information and address any questions the managers may have. He's been working closely with the city of Eden Prairie, making sure that it has been ground truth with their observation has been calibrated, and I believe it's ready to roll out, Brandon, if I'm not mistaken. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Barnes.
Thank you, Administrator Jeffrey, managers. Bear with me for a moment. I try to
Stop sharing.
figure out how to share my screen. Oh, there we go. You stopped. Now I can start, I believe. Share. Hopefully that came through okay. You should be seeing a title slide to a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank
I
you.
can see it.
Thank you. Good evening. Administrator Jeffrey mentioned, my name is Brandon Barnes. I'm a senior water resources engineer with Bar Engineering. Most of my work is related to stormwater modeling, floodplain mapping, floodplain risk mitigation projects. I've been fortunate enough to be the Bar project manager for several updates to the watershed district stormwater model over the past 8 years. So this evening, I appreciate the time here to share some of the background related to the flood risk vulnerability evaluation prioritization work that we've done within the city of Eden Prairie, really, and it's using funding through with an environmental assistance grant from the MPCA. The collaboration began with floodplain vulnerability evaluation following the updates to Atlas 14 rainfall depths, and those prior evaluations identified a number of flood prone locations really throughout the city and throughout the watershed district. And with a number of flood prone locations, given a finite amount of public resources, time, energy, dollars, it led to the question of how do we prioritize these projects? How do we establish a process to determine which areas should be evaluated first? And so the watershed district took the lead to develop a prioritization framework to really address those questions. This task order is applying that framework to the city of Eden Prairie. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that we've done. I'll start by providing really a brief overview of the work that was done under the task order here. The portion of the watershed that's highlighted in pink, that's the portion with Eden Prairie. I'll step through the items there on the brief agenda, and then we'll wrap up with next steps for the watershed district for the city following completion of the work that was included or that is included within task order 35. So in a very basic sense, a stormwater model is one tool that informs management decisions. And because industry standards change, available information changes. So new LiDAR data is available, better data sets for building outlines are available, more accurate information for impervious cover becomes available. Development, redevelopment within the watershed occurs and continues to occur. The model continues to change and be updated as well. And so what's shown here is maybe an abbreviated history, a recent history of updates that have been made to the watershed district's model. In 2014, Atlas 14 was published, and in 2015, the watershed district finished updating their stormwater models to incorporate those revised rainfall depths. The result of that was identifying several flood-prone structures. And in 2016, the models were then used to identify those structures along creek crossings, along the creek and adjacent to lakes, larger lakes within the watershed district. As part of that study, the work was done to evaluate how sensitive or vulnerable different areas of the watershed would be to future climate change and increases in rainfall depths. And really the outcome of that was feedback from TAC members, specifically the cities, indicating that when there's a lot of these structures, there's questions on how do we address them, which order do we address them, and also that additional resolution needed to be added to the watershed district model, such that there was a similar level of detail in the model that the watershed district used, and the level of resolution member cities needed in order to evaluate flooding and manage their municipal systems. So looking for agreement. Order in 2021, the framework was developed, and here 2022, 2023, we're now applying that framework to the city of Eden Prairie. So the first step under task order 35 was really making updates to the model. This included adding resolution to the model to increase the level of detail in the storm sewer system. So the image on the left is the watershed divides in the model that we started with at the beginning of the project, and the watershed the graphic on the right are the sub-watersheds that we have now, the level of resolution in the model. And so you can see that the total number of watersheds within Eden Prairie more than doubled we really increased that level of resolution, added detail to smaller stormwater ponds, topographic depressions. We added level of resolution such that it was consistent with the level of detail that the city of Eden Prairie is incorporating in their models, but it's also consistent with the level of resolution that the watershed district added within Bloomington a couple of years ago. For reference, there were about 300 new sub-watersheds that were added within the Riley Creek watershed, and over 800 new sub-watersheds that were added within the Purgatory Creek watershed. There was more resolution added to the Purgatory Creek watershed because there was less resolution in that model, that watershed, in the starting model. And so now both of them are at kind of that consistent level of detail. So that introduced new watershed divides, new storm sewer information, new ponds. And so after we added that information, the next step was to validate the model so that the model was still able to simulate observed, measured water levels in creeks, lakes, ponds, wetlands throughout the watershed district. And so for this effort, the model was validated using information collected at 33 different locations that are shown there. The blue points are the large monitors. The red points are high water levels that watershed district staff went out in the field following rainfall events and collected information, collected water levels. The yellow points are smaller stormwater ponds that district staff set up temporary gauges in 2021 to collect information that could be used specifically to validate results within the city of Eden Prairie. And then the WAMP stations are shown in the white points there. I will say, I do want to pause that the watershed district staff really did all the heavy lifting here, gathering the monitoring data, organizing it, post-processing it into a way that we could really use it for reference to compare to the model results. They did a fantastic job with that. This evening, I will spare you from going through all 3 rainfall events in 33 different locations and stepping through a whole bunch of model results, but I do want to show you a couple of sample plots here so you get a feel for what we're looking at and how the model compares to a location that for a smaller stormwater pond within the city of Eden Prairie. The location is shown in the figure on the left, and the 2 plots on the right show the measured water surface elevations, the blue lines, and then the simulated water surface elevations are the orange lines. With these 2 rainfall events, these were the largest 2 rainfall events that we had data for during 2021, the period that we were monitoring. As you may remember, 2021 was a very dry year, and so these ended up being rainfall events on the order of 1 to 2 year return periods. And what we see here is that the water levels are either below the outlet elevation, that yellow horizontal line across the plots, or very near the outlet elevation. And the model does a good job of simulating both peaks and timing of the runoff that occurs or from the watershed tributary to this particular stormwater pond. We also, again, simulated water levels in larger lakes, water bodies here. And the difference in this slide is now there's 3 plots on the right. And so we didn't have the monitoring data in the smaller ponds that during the 2014 event, during the larger rainfall event. So because there wasn't any very extremely large rainfall events during our monitoring period, we also simulated the June 2014 event, which caused several locations of localized flooding within the watershed. There were trail closures, road closures at different locations. And so it was a memorable event from a city staff perspective. It was a memorable event because we've also used it to validate this model in particular before. And so it gave us a comparison point so that we had a range of rainfall events. And as you can see here, this is an example plot from Lotus Lake. And overall, the model does a good job of simulating measured water surface elevations for a variety of rainfall events. We didn't one of the things I want to point out here is we reviewed these results with city staff. They provided feedback to us as we were working through this validation process, and we got concurrence from city staff before we proceeded to run any design events. We didn't want to simulate any design events until we were confident that the model was simulating what was observed and measured during this period where we had available data. After we got that concurrence, discussing with city staff, we ran a number of design events and developed inundation mapping to identify flood-prone areas, and then did that inundation mapping with building outlines to identify potentially flood-prone structures. Before we started these updates, there were approximately 300 structures that were identified within the 100-year floodplain within the city of Eden Prairie. After these updates, there's approximately 400 structures within the city of Eden Prairie. And this increase in the number of structures is really consistent with what we've seen in other locations in the watershed where we add resolution. Most of these additional structures are located around smaller ponds, topographic depressions, wetlands, areas where prior to this update, the level of resolution in the model wasn't there to capture that flood risk. And now that we add that level of resolution, we're able to illustrate and quantify the flood risk in some of these smaller ponds, smaller depressions. So with that, we have a model. We've identified really on the order of hundreds of flood-prone structures. And when you look at a map like this, that can be daunting. There's a lot of points in the map. The question that municipalities ask, and Eden Prairie is no different, is where do we start? Again, there's a finite amount of public resources, staff, funding, time, and every location cannot be addressed at once. And so applying a framework allows for prioritizing these areas so that there's a systematic approach to how to begin. And so the prioritization framework that we applied was developed back in 2020 with input from the TAC. And the categories are shown here. So there are 6 categories, and I'll step through all 6 of these here real briefly over the next few slides. But I do want to highlight here that there are categories there are decision factors that are commonly used to identify feasible, practical, efficient projects. And so, for example, one of those factors that many times is considered is overall project cost. And you'll notice that project cost is not one of those categories that shows up on the list here. And that's intentional because the intent of the prioritization effort is to identify locations where additional study is needed. Feasibility studies are needed to inform the next step. And so because those additional feasibility studies haven't been completed at this point, there's no costs to be able to compare relative to each other. This framework is intended to provide direction at where do we study next and how do we approach further evaluation of those flood-prone areas that were identified. So with that, the prioritization framework itself lives within a large Excel file that organizes the GIS data, the input from these different categories. And so this is just an example of what one of these categories looks like inside the Excel tool. Along the bottom of the figure there's Excel tabs. And so these are tabs that city staff, watershed district staff, they can open up and they can change the parameters, the variables for the framework and see how that reshuffles the different order of flood-prone areas in terms of the priority. So this one here shows the scoring points in the peach cells or tan cells there. So if there's no flood-prone structures within a given area, there's 0 points assigned to that area. Whereas if there's greater than 10 residential structures, there's 10 points assigned to that given area. So for a given flood-prone area, the more points that gets assigned, the higher the priority. And so these point values, these thresholds for number of structures, for how we assign those points to different areas. All of these were initially defined in when the framework was developed, and then they were reviewed with City of Eden Prairie staff to make sure that the scoring was applicable for the city, and that the results of the prioritization framework generally aligned with what city staff were expecting, making sure that the areas that they saw flooding kind of aligned here, the areas that they know and have flood prone structures generally aligned. So it was gut checked here to make sure that the result of this tool aligned with what city staff experienced and what has been observed within the city. So this was the flood prone structures. Again, this goes back to this map where we identify the number of flood prone structures. Again, there's about 400 of them within the city. And essentially each area where there is a structure identified, there's a score or a point value assigned to it for this particular category. The second category is the prioritization framework, or the frequency of flooding. And so the intent with this category is that the more frequently a structure floods, the higher points that area would receive. So if an area doesn't flood during a 100-year event, there's no points assigned to it. Whereas if an area floods during a 2-year event, there's 10 points assigned to it. So with this one of the things that we talked about with city staff, but also with attack in general, is how we assign these point values in terms of frequency of flooding. We use that as a proxy for depth. And so here I'd point out that the underlying assumption is that if it floods during a 2-year event, the depth of flooding during larger events is presumed or assumed to be deeper than if it didn't flood for those more frequent events. So you won't see depth of flooding show up in any of the categories. The third criteria is social vulnerability. And what this criteria gets at is looking at how different populations within the watershed district will have resources available to recover following a natural disaster. And really it's a data set here. The social vulnerability index is the one that we're referencing. It's based on US Census data. And so we're looking at different quartiles within that data set. The idea being that populations that need additional support before, during, or after a flood event are more vulnerable populations and therefore receive a higher score, and populations that have means or are less vulnerable to recover following a flood event receive a lower score here for this one. And you can see in the background there how this index varies across the watershed district. The next category we looked at was project efficiency. And so this category was defined as whether a project could be supported by multiple stakeholders. So was there either a potential financial partner, or would a project meet multiple goals in both the watershed district and the city's stormwater management plan? And so we looked at those goals in the different plans. We identified potential funding partners based on proximity to regional park, recreational areas, state and county transportation, roads. This is an interesting one because I think it illustrates the flexibility of this framework, in that we can take an initial shot at identifying project partners, but certainly funding partners, project partners present themselves and opportunities arise. And so when that happens, the scoring for different areas can also change as additional partners and opportunities are identified. And the framework is flexible enough to account for that and update the scoring accordingly. The fifth category here looked at multiple benefits. And so certainly each area we're looking at reducing flood risk within the watershed, but we also looked at proximity to wetlands, to ecological corridors, and to parks. And with the idea that if a project could provide additional recreational benefits or provide improved ecosystem services, there should be additional points associated with that for projects that could achieve multiple benefits within the community. And the final category here was looking at critical infrastructure. And so critical infrastructure was identified by TAC members as infrastructure that's really important to keep functioning and providing services even during a flood event. So critical transportation routes, think about streets that are needed for emergency personnel to access. A lot of times these are defined as county roads, major city collector streets. We identified emergency services sites, so hospitals, police stations, fire departments, and municipal government buildings. Emergency support services, so areas, locations where the public may need to access to or convene either during or following a flood event. So schools, grocery stores, churches, those types of locations. And then critical city services, so sanitary lift stations, emergency routes, and then city well locations. And so for each one of those points, those critical infrastructure points that fell within the inundation area, we assigned point values to it. So this one was one where there was no cap on the number of point values. For every critical piece of critical infrastructure that was within the floodplain, we assigned additional points. And so when we run through those 6 different criteria and assign points values based on the framework and scoring assigned to each of those criteria, the end result is an organized kind of list that can be sorted, where every inundation extent or flood-prone area within the watershed district has a unique value. And again, it can be sorted such that the lower scores indicate flood-prone areas that have a general lower priority based on the categories and scoring identified. In some instances here, though, as we went through this, we realized that it might be appropriate to overwrite a score where maybe private storm sewer data isn't available, the GIS files require updates, or there's something that's known to city staff or watershed district staff that might require an adjustment. And so with that, on the far right, there is a manual kind of place here for staff to enter notes. And if scores are overwritten, the tool provides that flexibility such that there's documentation to track that documentation as to what the additional consideration might be. So the overall summary table again provides how kind of that list on relative priority of each area. This table can be linked dynamically to GIS so that we can view these scores on a spatial scale. And so what this figure shows is kind of a heat map of the initial prioritization that came out of this work with the city of Eden Prairie. I use that term initial deliberately again, just to acknowledge that there can be changes that will impact and affect the relative priority of this list. So for example, new funding partners can be identified, projects can be implemented that may change frequency of flooding in other areas. Goals can change, opportunities can present themselves, all of which may reshuffle the prioritization list. The other part that we talked about, discussed quite a bit with the city of Eden Prairie as we were working through this process, is that the list is not intended to be rigid. Rather, it's one way to organize how you go about addressing flood-prone areas, understanding there's a limitations, finite number of resources. And so it presents a consistent approach, a way to approach this, one tool for city and district staff to be able to use to identify which areas to study next. So this is the kind of that initial snapshot where everything ended up now, or where it sits now at the end of this task order 35 work with the detailed model. Now, one of the things that came up when we were scoping the project, and I'm switching topics here just briefly, is that the MPCA requested that we compare our findings to publicly available information. And so perhaps some of you are aware of the Flood Factor website or Flood Factor tool. It's a free online tool that it's a website where you can go and you can learn if a property may be susceptible to flooding, if it is potentially at risk. And then it also tries to provide some information on how that risk changes over time, estimate damages associated with flooding, essentially information to make communities more informed. This website has a very similar approach, scope as to what we are doing and working through with Eden Prairie on a much more detailed scale. And so because Flood Factor is looking nationwide, it has a much broader audience. And so its intent is to provide general flood risk information to that broad audience, whereas the work that we did with Eden Prairie was very focused. It included very detailed site-specific information on the storm sewer system, outlet control structures, and so forth. And so with that, the work that we've done with Eden Prairie provides a much better characterization, more detailed characterization of flood risk within Eden Prairie. Now, however, Flood Factor identifies, you can see there are just over 1,000 flood-prone structures within the city. Within the Riley Creek and Purgatory Creek portions of Eden Prairie, we've identified 400 flood-prone structures. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, but in general, Flood Factor tends to identify more properties that are at an increased risk of flooding. Again, it's a general comparison. And I think the takeaway in our comparison to Flood Factor based on is that because we have much more detailed modeling, much more site-specific information that we're accounting for, the watershed district model, the city's model, does a much better job of defining flood risk within the city. However, not all communities have access to the models and tools and resources that the watershed district and Eden Prairie have. And so in locations like that within the country, Flood Factor can be a very useful resource for communities where those tools aren't available when they're just starting the conversation about defining flood risk and looking for information. If we dive in here just a little bit, here's a sample area just to the north of Lake Riley. And we can kind of compare the differences within that inset rectangle. So the updated modeling and mapping that we did with the city of Eden Prairie is that top inset, and there's about 10 structures, I think, within that inset that are identified. And then the same rectangle, there's a snapshot from what Flood Factor is showing. And within there's around 17 structures that are shown at risk of flooding. And so you can start to get a little context for how Flood Factor is overestimating the number of structures. But in general, you can see that the general inundation locations are similar. The extents in Flood Factor are a little bit larger. And again, that's because of the national perspective, the broader audience that Flood Factor is trying to reach. They can't incorporate the really detailed site-specific information that we're incorporating with the task order that we're just wrapping up here. And so in the report that we're preparing, we have a summary comparing these two. And again, this summary comparison was included at the request of the MPCA as part of the grant funding that we're completing this project under. So wrapping up here just with a couple of next steps here. This is a starting point. There's now that there's a map that shows, hundreds of flood prone locations, now that we have a way to organize and sort those locations, that map might become a little less daunting. This provides information on where to begin. So beginning with areas at the top of the list, now the next steps in taking that list would be to consider completing feasibility studies for flood risk mitigation, identifying partners, project partners, field verifying low structures. So this study was done really at a desktop level based on LiDAR information, building outlines and so forth. And so field survey verification of those structures is also a next step. In terms of this task order here, we are finalizing project deliverables. So our models, our report have been reviewed by city staff. We've also completed a round of review by MPCA staff. And so we've addressed city staff comments. We're working on addressing comments from the MPCA, and we anticipate finalizing our deliverables here next month. That's for task order 35. We've worked through this process with Bloomington, with Eden Prairie. And so there's coordination with other cities within the watershed district. I touched on feasibility studies and also identifying additional funding sources for implementation of those projects. So I appreciate your time this evening. I realize that was a bit of a whirlwind through all of the work that has been done here over the last year and a half. And certainly if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer those and provide additional details as needed.
Do any of the managers have any questions or staff?
President Ziegler?
Okay, I think Manager Cook got his question, or
Just
Manager Cook, go ahead.
I can let Manager Crafton proceed, and then I'll follow up with my question.
Manager Crafton.
Well, thanks, Brendan, for all this work, presenting, compiling this. I was just curious, so what kind of, feedback are we getting from PCA? So hopefully funding will flow from the good job you've done here, but I just wondered if there are any indications from the city and from PCA as to what potential they see for this and using and hopefully fulfilling some of their own priorities and challenges that they're seeing with climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Manager Crafton. The discussions with the PCA at this point have been focused really on technical comments on the report in terms of content in the report necessary to fulfill the requirements tied to the grant funding for the study.
Okay.
We haven't started conversations with the PCA at this point in time, looking forward as to what is the next steps then for project implementation that the MPCA might support.
Okay, I remember when we first got this model before you guys got your hands on it and started improving it. So it's been a long time coming, but it looks like it's a really, really good tool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Manager Cook.
Yes, thank you. So a couple of things kind of struck me as going through the presentation. One is that, several of the links that obviously contribute to the, source of waters or whatever it is, only, significant, like for example, Lotus Lake totally was outside the, Eden Prairie. You had half of, Riley that's outside. So, and you have their associated floodplain. So my question really is how good is your, is your software or algorithms given that, those two significant bodies of water lay outside and what was done to take into account the impact that those, for example, those two bodies of water might have on, your ultimate conclusions.
Yeah, Manager Cook, let me take a shot at this, and you may need to help me with this, clarify your question here. But those two water bodies are located within. I mean, they're clearly within the larger watersheds, right? The Riley Creek watershed, the Purgatory Creek watershed, and this study included the entire Purgatory Creek watershed, the entire Lake Riley watershed. And so the model didn't cut off at the Eden Prairie municipal boundary here. We're looking at this as a system approach. So for those water bodies and other water bodies in particular, throughout the watershed, when we run design rainfall events, we reset their normal water levels so that they're at the outlet control structure, at the outlet control elevation, so that when the rainfall event occurs, water is leaving those water bodies and other lakes within the watershed and is tributary to the area then that is flowing through Eden Prairie. So those water bodies were accounted for in the analysis, and then that tributary water, the water levels, within the portion of Riley that's within Eden Prairie, but also at all of those other points that were on the validation slide, all of those plots were discussed with city staff to make sure that the model was characterizing the measured water surface elevations. And then at a broader review, the inundation extents for the design events were shared with city staff. We wanted to make sure that where we were mapping inundation areas that generally lined up with where city staff had documented flooding, where they've been receiving calls and complaints from. So that's a picture, broader on how the larger watershed was accounted for within the analysis. I don't know if I exactly answered your question, and if I didn't, if you could clarify, I'd be happy to try again.
If I could continue, Mr. President.
Manager Cook?
Okay, so, well, good. I'm glad you did that. It's just that it was a little confusing having the slide, with Eden Prairie outlined, left me, again, just a few minutes looking at the slide, left me with an impression that, were you taking into account the rest of the, what do I want to call it, the tributaries and the contributing tributaries. So good. I'm glad you took that into account, because that would obviously, make a difference, particularly given the size of those water bodies and their in the areas that contribute to them. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And I don't know if a refinement to the slide makes any sense in the future, but I just throw that out there. But you explained it. The second point, though, it struck me there was, a 10-year, an area that, had a 10-year cycle to it, if I understood how you ranked them, and one that ranked was rated lower that had a 2-year repeat. I'm probably not using the right adjectives or on that basis. And it just struck me that why would that be, and that it would be helpful. I maybe somebody who's not totally familiar with this, if there were some footnotes or explanations as to why something that, if you didn't know better, you would say, well, why would a something that happens every 10 year be ranked up there further than something that happens every 2 years? At least that's what crossed my mind. And I'm sure there's probably legitimate reasons, but it seems to me it would be a good thing to have the notes or something that would explain why that, why something is different than what you would think on first blush, if you understand what I'm saying. So that was my, so I would have questions about those. So, why does something happen every 2 years way down on the list compared to something that happens once every 100? I think there was an example where a 100-year event was ranked higher than the 2-year event. And there's lots of reasons for it, but it would be good somehow to, address those so that what would seem to be not make sense at first blush would be explainable. So those are my two comments, but thank you for the work. And you also answered my question that I had as to what was the basis for your modeling, and effectively its granularity, I take it, and reducing 1,000 possibilities to 400 is, helps one focus on what should be addressed first. The last thing I just thought of it now was I take it that nothing or no concrete steps or action items were added to any of these. That would be something that would be decided after, validation of this and of the data. I mean, like, do we remove houses? Do we raise roads? Do we, et cetera? I assume that's a further next step. Like, correct?
Yeah, thank you, Manager Cook. There's several there. So in terms of the Lotus Lake slide, I absolutely understand your point and can understand the confusion there. The intent with this slide was to show, illustrate a larger lake and a smaller pond, and I should have picked one with Indian Prairie.
Okay.
We'll make that understand that where that could be confusing. The footnote you had, your second comment was regarding frequency of flooding and why maybe 100-year area, somewhere that an area that floods only once during 100-year might be ranked higher than an area that floods, say, during a 2-year event, when you look at that. And so in that example, that general example there, for the frequency of flooding, they would have scored different, where the 2-year would have scored higher and the 100-year would have scored lower. But when we add in the scores for the other 5 criteria, those particular locations may switch, right? So for example, if it's a critical infrastructure that's in the 100-year, whereas maybe it's not something that's quantified or classified as critical infrastructure in the 2-year, that could go towards how those areas switch. In the report that we're preparing for the top 10 areas, we have tables that highlight what are the criteria that contribute to the scoring for those
Okay.
top areas, the areas at the top of the list. And then in the tool, it's all very transparent. You can open the Excel file and see what is contributing to the score. So it's not just one number. Your third point was reason for the modeling and the granularity. Absolutely. I think it also helps for this getting buy-in consensus from the cities where you have the watershed district has got a model that you're using for managing water levels, and now there's an agreement with what the city is referencing. There's a benefit. There's really a benefit to that. The granularity is part of this. And your last point was concrete kind of next steps that.
Yes.
In your question, you used examples: raise roads, mitigate for structures, that sort of thing. And what the intent of this list is meant to be is to identify where feasibility studies, additional study and evaluation would be needed in order to inform those types of actions that you described. There's a number of ways you can mitigate flood risk and for an area, and what would be the most efficient, practical, cost-effective way may differ, based on each area. So one area might be raising the road, another area might be constructing a pond or some, so forth. And so that's where the additional study would be needed.
Yep.
And this list informs what areas to focus on rather than being presented with a map with points everywhere. It can help you focus and make the decision on where you could start with that process.
Yeah, very good. I just wanted to confirm it. Actual solutions aren't part of this part yet of this work or this report. That's for another day, like you said, feasibility studies, and then, how can we fix this? And cost, I assume, will go into, like we in the district rank things, depending upon what their cost is, whether you're going to get partners, et cetera. I assume that's going to be a second or third set of criteria that would be put into this model to come up with recommendation as to what to do, where, and when.
Yeah, cost was deliberate. It was a deliberate decision not to include cost as
Makes
part of
sense.
the study. Yeah, because for an area, you know, as you said, maybe there's raising a road, maybe there's building a pond, maybe there's diverting stormwater. And at this level, those projects aren't defined enough to assign a cost per area. So those costs would come, as you say, as part of that next step.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Do any other managers have any questions?
President Ziegler.
Administrator Jeffrey.
Yeah, if I may, I just would like to add a couple of things to this. One is that while Eden Prairie was the focus of this, the city of Bloomington has already been completed, and Engineer Sylvia can correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe perhaps even Brandon knows, but I believe Minnetonka has developed their own high resolution model. So the bulk of our watershed, with the exception of Chanhassen, Shorewood, and Peapaven, are complete at this high resolution. In addition, the same funding source that was available to do phase one would be available depending on projects identified for any phase two part of it as well. So we would try and procure funding through that grant program as we work through this list and identify areas of high concern.
So,
Good.
Mr. President,
Manager Dwell.
so a couple of general questions here for Mr. Barnes. So one of the flood level risks is 100-year use in your modeling. Many parts of the country are experiencing 100-year flood results every year, and then now going to 500-year. Does that impact your view of this at all? If in fact 100-year is not an adequate high water mark, so to speak?
Thank you, Manager DeVal. I think it's an interesting question. So we selected 100-year for identifying flood-prone structures for this study and for the prior work with Bloomington. The 100-year at this point is it's the event that is referenced in many regulatory programs. Now, so that gives us the context of what we're happening, or what we're trying to tackle at the moment based on the adopted programs. But the previous studies that the district has done, and we've gone through and I have identified structures, it looks at vulnerability for events larger than the 100-year. And we took an approach where we looked at, when I say larger events, we looked at the uncertainty in the 100-year. So it's one estimate, and we said, okay, well, what happens if the estimate for the 100-year is off and it's higher, and that upper bound is a good proxy for the current estimate for the 500-year, but it's also the same estimate or very similar estimate for a mid-century estimate for where the 100-year could be going. And so the district does have a data set where we've identified those additional structures, and that can be referenced during these next steps, as for feasibility studies, when you're looking at projects and that question comes up and you say, okay, how do we make a project more robust? How do we build resiliency into the system? That those simulations can inform what's the incremental cost for providing risk mitigation for that next level. And so that's a data set that is available. The watershed district, was developed under a previous task order, and the models are debugged and can be used to run those larger rainfall events.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions?
President Ziegler.
Manager Crafton.
So I remember when we updated this for Alice 14. At that time, Scott, we had discussions, in meetings, and Brandon, I'm sure was part of that, but precipitation was kept increasing. And so we went higher. It was like 7 inches, and then we went up scenarios for up to 10. my understanding was that those scenarios are incorporated into the model. Just not maybe exercise because you picked a point at which you're going to do things, but there's a lot more flexibility based on increased precipitation. Is that correct?
Manager Crafton, that's exactly right. Those depths, those depths can be simulated with the model, have been simulated with the model. The model is, it is a tool that's capable of evaluating how changes to the system impacts elevations for those types of events. That extreme event just wasn't selected by, to be incorporated within this particular prioritization framework, but the models are set up ready to evaluate that, those larger rainfall events. And your recollection of the 10 inches is spot on.
Thanks.
Okay, Administrator Jeffrey, is there any more on this subject we have?
President Ziegler, managers, I have nothing else at this time, unless there are further questions for Mr. Barnes or Engineer Sobiak.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes, for your presentation and your work on this topic.
Thank you.
Hearing no other questions, what's next on our agenda?
President Ziegler, next on the agenda is to discuss the two quotes that were received for the boardroom setup to make it more conducive to manager meetings, trying to take into account comments I've heard from different managers, one regarding being able to have a more parabolic shape to the table so that they can actually see the other managers, to being able to view the staff better, and to have access to screens, and especially with looking at going to a hybrid environment where interactive technology can be available to members of the public and managers of case may be. So I have received two quotes, one from Alternative Furniture Design and the other from let's see, Line Tech. And they are relatively similar. I will go through them both with you quick, and then perhaps at the May meeting, if you have to make motion on it, but I do have a recommendation of the one that I was like. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I will show you the first quote that we got. I do want to add a caveat that this first quote that I received was received back in December. So I'm not certain that they would honor this quote as is, but I think it gives a very good ballpark of where it's at. So a few things that I tried to look at. One, I already talked about the parabolic design of the board table. The second is I wanted the tables to have data ports and be electrified so that managers could have access to tablets, laptops, or be able to present things as they wanted. So if you think of the boardroom, I know it's been a long time since anybody's been in there, but the area to the top is where the projector screen is. This area off to the upper left-hand corner is where the office area is, where the copier printer is. On the south is where all the staff offices are. Here's the main entrance to the building, and here's the kitchen. So in this instance, we would have the layout for the staff. This is fairly static and where it needs to be, because one of the issues with this steel post construction and concrete floor is there aren't a tremendous amount of sources for electrical outlets. So this is that pillar, and both tables would come off of that. The quotes do not include the electrician cost to configure this outlet to fit both of these tables. But this would be allowed for staff here and any other presenters to be in this place. And then we got 4 additional tables for when we have conferences or training sessions. The managers is set up in this way. And remember, I had mentioned earlier to you at another point where this is the configuration that would not allow for that 3 feet of separation between the managers because of the way it's set up. But it does allow for that parabolic shape. This would be the source for electricity. But so this is more dynamic. We can rotate it as need be. In this little conference room that exists now, that is now Steph Bachum's office, there is an 84-inch or 72-inch television. My envision would be to have that television either available on the wall or on some type of rolling apparatus, so that we would have, in addition to the projector screen, we would also have that television so that it can be seen from multiple areas. The rest of it would be AV setup. So some other costs for the managers to be thinking about, I would recommend that we get at a minimum some type of tablet for each of the managers, whether it be an iPad or a Surface or something of that nature, but just something so that you'll have it in front of you and can see what's being presented as well, in addition to the screens. So this quote came in a total quote of $16,000. That was, again, not including the electrician costs, not including the tablets, but having data ports and electricity for those tables. The second configuration by Alternative Business Furnitures, which I will note in this case, I was able to go into their showroom, actually see the product that was going to be provided. This was of high quality, I felt, from when I was there. I cannot say the same for the other product because I did not see the other product. I've been provided brochures on it, but I have not seen it firsthand. In this scenario, same thing, same layout. Here's our screen up top. Here's shelving in these areas. Managers would be here, pillars would come off. This quote has 3 separate tables. Remember, we had the 4 extra tables in that first quote, but we only had 4 tables here. Here, they've just shown 5 tables here. We wouldn't necessarily need it, this configuration, but just keep that in mind as we're comparing quotes. But it allows for that 3 feet of separation for each manager. It allows you each to have your own space. Nobody's on top of each other. Nobody would have where the 2 tables come together to try and maneuver around. So I prefer this configuration, if for no other reason than that, but also because I have been able to see the materials used, and I do believe that they are good quality. Further, this quote is $12,862. Now, remember, this quote has 3 extra tables in it, and I will go up to that. That's these tables right here. So if we're assuming $1,600 a table, we can take $4,800 off of this quote, which would bring it down to a little under 12,000. And this one being a little over 12,000. So this one's a little more expensive, but I think it gives the configuration that the managers were looking for with the boardroom tables. If there are any questions or additional information you would like me to get from either of these 2 firms, please let me know. I'm happy to do so. But otherwise, I have sent these all to you, and you can review them at your leisure. Call me with any questions if you want. We'll look over the quotes, but that's what I have for this.
President Ziegler, I have a question.
Manager Pedersen.
Terry, could you talk about how, not just for the board meeting, but how this setup could be utilized for all of the other meetings that the district has, as well as kind of staff working cooperatively together?
President Ziegler, Manager Pedersen. So we did, when having these tables put in the way they are, that's exactly what was thought of. So if we have, for instance, we oftentimes host the smart salting workshops, things of that nature, where people might want to remote into those. In that case, we would just change the configuration so that the tables were were parallel to the front wall and laid out just like they would be in a typical classroom setting. And then the projector and television would be available for either A, people to remote in, or B, people to do displays, or both. It would also allow for remote presentations. So one of the things that one of the CAC members had shared with us recently was a class that I forget who was putting it on, but it had to do with soils. It looked like an interesting class, and in reaching out to the sponsors of it, it is something we could purchase the recording of and have it displayed for whoever wanted to see it there. So it would give us opportunities to do that. This scenario, we could utilize the board tables as well in that scenario, but my thought was that these would probably be reserved for the board members, and we would utilize these tables and then what we have for overflow seating.
So Terry, if you're looking at the group of your employees and staff working together, these things can be moved around enough to where you feel like this is usable in any way that you might need it as a staff.
Correct. All of these tables are portable and foldable. The only caveat being that once we would disconnect them from the power source, they wouldn't have access to that. But we could arrange them in any manner we needed to accommodate this setting.
Mr. President,
Manager Cook.
a couple of comments. First of all, I would just want furniture that would hold up over some period of time, and whether it's made out of plastic, wood, composite, I don't necessarily care. Quite frankly, I think we could get by with 5 square tables for the managers. And that would allow us to separate them. I don't know that we need any trapezoid models. They don't have to, fit together. The more distance, the better. And actually, the more surface area, because quite frankly, I'm probably going to bring my own laptop. I can't see off of an iPad. I think iPads, quite frankly, are fairly worthless. They need a decent sized screen. I think we should each have a decent sized screen. Carver County, they're not the biggest, but at least they're bigger than an iPad. And each one of the commissioners has one of those. I think it's really up to us to have the view of whatever's being presented. And the big screen is great for the public, but they could be bringing their laptops and joining on Zoom, and they'd be able to see everything as well. So my point is these don't have to be elaborate. They just, I think, have to be well made. I think using square ones would give each manager, the right kind of space, both on the front and the back end, and would allow us to, separate even further if they wanted to. What my concern is just the configuration of the room and the screen where it's at. And I know it's there for a reason. I don't know. It's just not a great space for, for configuring some things. And I don't know. Again, like I said, I don't know how many of the public and what they need to see or what they can't see. My guess is that most people will, unless they want to make a personal presentation, will probably tune in by Zoom. And what I'm wondering is, would we actually flip it around so all the managers are looking at the screen and the presentations, and the staff could be on 2 sides, talking about it. There's nothing wrong with necessarily with the public, looking at our backs. This is just not it's not ideal, for conducting a meeting and seeing the materials, etc. I would like us facing the big screen, actually. And so we could, see it without having to crane our necks. Right now, the way that configuration is, and there's nothing per se wrong with it, it's just that we can't see the big screen, and you can get a 72-inch, TV, but yeah, I don't know that that's a substitute for our screen. And or maybe we get a bigger screen and put it, basically hang it on that post. You know what I'm saying? So it would be on the post. We could have a screen there that we managers could be looking at. At least we'd have something large enough, that we could see. So that's the thing I want to see. I want to be able to see what the presentations are. I like the idea of the semicircle because I can see the rest of the managers' faces. That's one of the things I do like about the Zoom. And so we can see everybody's faces and facial expressions and whether they're awake, asleep, or other characteristics. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. I really want to be able to see the presentations. That's kind of my number one thing, and be able to be far enough apart. Maybe it'd be cheaper just to have rectangles as opposed to rectangles and trapezoids. I don't know. Other than just thoughts off the top. I haven't had a chance to study it, obviously.
President Ziegler.
Administrator Jeffrey.
Yeah, Manager Cook. The only reason I laid this configuration out that way is something that you mentioned that you weren't concerned about. That was having your back to the public. Yep. So if that's not a concern for the managers, there's no reason we couldn't flip it around and have the managers here. As far as trapezoidal tables versus the rectangular tables, the trapezoidals are $1,025. The rectangles are actually more expensive than the trapezoidal units.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we could certainly have coming off of here, maybe have two coming off of here or an extra trapezoidal. So this middle one would be the post in essence, or it could, be in front. But yeah, we could certainly flip that around if that's what the managers want. Again, I just put it that way, only thinking of the audience and not having your back to them. But
yeah, Mr. President.
Manager Cook.
Administrator Jeffrey. Yeah, I'm not, fixed to anything other than I'd like to see the screen, big enough, because the computer, even a computer screen, gets pretty small, for doing that. I don't want to offend the public, but on the other hand, we don't have too many people there. I'm not intending to offend them, but if you take your parabolic curve, where we would have us managers, what if on that, I take it that's the post that exists, the one between the two rectangles?
that's
right there.
This little square right here. Yeah.
Well, could we configure and have a screen, a drop down, or a big TV screen hanging on that post facing us? Would that be, is that feasible, or could you talk to people and see if that would be feasible? That way we don't have to see the projector screen, but we would have something big enough that we could see the presentation. I'm just throwing out ideas. You talk to the people, just thoughts.
So President Ziegler, Manager Cook, to that point, yeah. So what 9 Mile Creek did was they took their large TV and actually mounted it on like what a whiteboard's on, where it has wheels. They can then move that to wherever it is that needs to be seen. There's also obviously retractable arms that could be mounted to that pillar. So yeah, I think there are a number of different ways we could do that. So ultimately, what I'm hearing is you would just much prefer being able to see the other managers and be able to see the largest display area you possibly can, whether it be the screen that's existing or whatever our new display would be.
That's my ideas. Those are just my ideas. You hit the two issues, right? The nail on the head on both of those issues. See each other, and then be able to see as big a screen as feasible, so we can see the presentations.
Got it.
Can we hear from the other managers? I guess that was one. Manager Crafton?
Yeah, I was looking at this. These are on wheels, right?
That is correct.
So we can just move our chairs around to the other side to watch a presentation. the other thing I was wondering about, when you host a TAC meeting, you've got like 30 people there sometimes.
Yep.
Seemed like, anyway, a huge crowd. So these can be moved around then so that you could accommodate that, or if we had, when we've done workshops and you had the tables laid out, that wouldn't preclude you'd still be able to have that flexibility to set it up differently.
President Ziegler,
Yes,
Manager Crafton, yes, we would still maintain those old tables that we had when we have the TAC meetings or CAC meetings. Others, we tend to put it in a large square, large rectangle, so we would just continue that rectangular shape. So yes, and if it was something where we needed a classroom setting, then we would put them into the typical classroom roles. Also, if we had small group works, we could configure different work pods throughout the boardroom. So yes, there's a multitude of configurations we can do.
Thanks.
Manager Pedersen, did you have comments?
I already gave you a few right at the very beginning. I just was more interested in making sure that we have an incredible amount of flexibility so that it fits all the different ways in which we need seating and tables. As long as we're keeping the other tables we have, we can really accommodate a lot more people. I do remember when this discussion came up way back when we first moved into the space, we had a problem with how we could get electrical down to the projector and down to these tables in a way where people were not tripping all over cords. That was kind of an issue for us. And I just want to make sure that you, before you order the furniture, have the electrician take a look at all of this to try to give you an idea if this actually practically will work. You know, the electrical ports they're all in the ceiling, and to try to bring them down to fit into what you need for the additional tables here, you're gonna have to work that out.
Yeah, so President Ziegler, Manager Patterson, I did meet with an electrician from RESPEC, who's a commercial electrician. He actually ended up recommending flat boards under the carpet, just because of the issues with the concrete and studs. He said, we can do it. I'd be happy to take your money to do it, but it's going to cost you a lot more than just getting flat cords.
Mr. President,
Manager Cook?
on that note, I believe they call them runways that can lay on the floor and can handle, multiple, video cable and electrical cable. And you lay the runway down and they're movable and they plug into the wall. And so you could unplug them when you didn't have the meetings and then just plug them in. And even if they're expensive, I think it would help make the room utilizable or more utilizable. And I agree with you, Administrator Jeffrey. I mean, we got to have power. I mean, I'm probably going to be bringing a laptop, and if we end up having screens for everybody sometime in the future, I don't know, but the more we can do to make it flexible. So I just throw that out. I've seen it at a couple other large places where they put in these, I think they call them runways. I don't know what they call them, but and then they can put them down and with the tables and move them when they're done and all that good stuff. So thank you. I'm done. Very good, by the way. Thank you for the presentation.
And, sorry, Manager Duval, do you have any comments?
He's never been in there.
Oh, I'm awake now. No, I guess my only comment would be flexibility. It seems like, this isn't City Hall, so we don't need to have permanent structures in place. And in fact, we have many different uses for it. So it seems to me flexibility would be of the utmost importance. And I agree with Manager Cook's notion about the flexible electrical wiring. Hotels do this all the time. They have different configurations of rooms and requirements, and they don't rewire the room. They have these bridges or whatever you want to call them that cover up the cords. And then I guess the second thing is, it seems like if we can move these things around, that's really important for the different kinds of meetings. And in fact, there might be some meetings that arise as a result of the flexibility for the watershed in the future that haven't been conceived of yet. So anything that implies permanence seems like it might be questionable at this point. But then the other thing, if it is flexible, even in these configurations, if it is flexible, there's nothing that says we can't try out a couple different configurations at meetings and see what works.
Right.
Sure.
Okay, do we have any other questions or comments on the layout and for the move back to the, well, I guess I have one thinking about it. I know with COVID, a lot of people were putting up plexiglass barriers. We're not considering that at this time. They do seem kind of tacky.
President Ziegler, managers, yeah, I had not, if the managers like me to pursue that and look at, some type of a clear cubicle type space for each manager, put you in your hermetically sealed area, happy to do so. But yeah, I have not looked into that, but that kind of was not my thinking at this time, but I'm open to any suggestions the managers have. I want you to be comfortable coming into this setting.
So
Mr. I'm sorry, go ahead, Manager Bilal. Sorry.
I was just going to ask if somebody was going to make or was going to ask questions or be present at a meeting where they wanted to make a couple-minute presentation, where would they do that in either of these configurations?
Manager, President Ziegler, Manager DeVal, we do have a dais that currently, under the way we had been running the meeting, it had actually been sitting here in this area. If we had the managers here, we would likely move it to this position so that they can see, the managers can see the presenter, see the screens wherever we have it. So, but the dais itself is portable as well, so we can move that around. The other thing that I do like about thinking more and more about putting the managers here, this is where all our AV equipment is likely going to be stored anyway. And since staff is going to be responsible for the hybrid meeting and running the technology, it might make more sense from that perspective too, to have staff over here closer to that. Sorry, Manager Paul.
So if we had 8 CAC members and a half a dozen members from the public, where would they be in this configuration?
So, yeah, so we would have to align tables in such a way that we'd space them out in this area back in here. Now, again,
Or just folding chairs?
we do have we don't have folding chairs, but we have chairs that sit on those rolling racks that we wheel in and out of the garage for meetings.
But there's no reason for tables necessarily.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, are we done with this item? Was there anything more on our agenda?
Just a quick update on projects that we're at. Real quick, I'll just run down them. There isn't a tremendous amount of change at this point. Engineer Sobiak, though, however, has developed a spreadsheet that it really kind of just summarizes where we're at with the status of it, and I'll have that available starting at the next meeting. We are also working with legal counsel right now to develop more of a Gantt chart type of thing, not only the next step in the project, but who's going to be responsible for that step. When is the deadline? So for instance, if we know need to hold a public, we know we want to order the project on at our August meeting. When do we have to have the open house? When do we have to have everything? So we're working on that. The rest of it right now, we are, snow has finally melted. We'll get the rest of the survey for the Upper Riley Creek project. That's the one that is extending from the Highway 5 down to Lake Susan, but otherwise design to that point, accepting the survey work and having is done. I am reaching out to the individual property owners along that to gain right of entry, to go onto the property to do survey and to start introducing to them the concept that we'll need a more permanent right of entry to maintain any improvements that are done. Bluff Creek, we talked about the culvert at the other meeting. I think it was pretty much unanimous that didn't make sense to spend that much money. However, the city of Chanhassen did talk to MnDOT and the county to see if there was additional funding, and as we suspected, they really weren't interested in additional funding. So that isn't going really anywhere. I met out on site at St. Hubert's with the landscaper and with the administrator for St. Hubert's School. They are going to be out there June 1st to do all the spring maintenance. They went out already, fixed the snow fencing that's protecting the areas, cut down the dead plants, attended some erosion control issues. They're going to put down a little turf reinforcement mat at the inlet from into the rain garden. We are ordering wetland plants from Minnesota Native Landscape and/or Natural Shores. Staff Mahan and myself will be going out. I'm hoping to at our next meeting, the CAC has a proposal for the Board of Managers. They would like to form kind of a friends of a group, but really they would like a subcommittee because there's a number of people who really want to be active in the field and doing things. So this would be an opportunity to have some CAC members come and help us with the planting of those wetland areas. The WBIF, a watershed-based implementation funding convene meeting, was held last week. Representatives from Carver County, the city of Minnetonka, the city of Eden Prairie, and the city of Chanhassen were present. We went through a number of different projects, including the ones that we are currently working on, Upper Riley, Upper Bluff. And then we looked at a wetland restoration project that the city of Eden Prairie would like to do. And we looked at a stream restoration project in Purgatory Preserve right by the Scenic Heights Elementary that Minnetonka would like to do. And we looked at one other project, the decaf facility that the city of Chanhassen wanted to put in. It was decided by the group of water quality benefit, the percentage of cost that the watershed-based implementation funding would pay for. And for instance, it would be a drop in the bucket to pay for the Upper Riley. But for this reach within Purgatory Preserve, it would be a significant input, be highly visible. It'd be a chance to partner with Minnetonka, get back in there and do something with them. So the group has decided to do that. So I'm applying for that WBIF funding, working with Steve Christopher from Bowser on that. The Minnetonka will be the project manager and the lead on it. We will just be the administrator of the grant. I talked to project manager on the Rice Marsh Lake project. They will be going out to look at what needs to be done, spring maintenance out there. I believe they actually have a meeting set up with the landscaper. Was that Cardno, Scott? Their engineer Soviak? It wasn't Cardno. Cardno's on it. Who was Rice Marsh Lake?
I believe that's Land Bridge.
Okay, Landbridge. So Landbridge will be going out there and starting their spring maintenance. I believe that's what we've got. Engineer Soviak, anything I've missed on the projects that you'd like to add?
The only one thing I'd add, Administrator Jeffrey, is related to the Upper Bluff Creek project. Just a brief update that we're working on developing a task order to potentially see if the board wanted to move forward with an actual project and move towards design.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think we're looking at probably at the June meeting, having more discussions on that.
Yep. that's, if there's any specific questions about projects, happy to answer them right now. Otherwise, that's really what I had. Next month, though, we will have those two exhibits that I mentioned.
Well, Mr. President,
Manager Cook,
there's nothing else on the agenda. Am I correct?
That is correct.
And if I am correct, I will move to adjourn.
we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Everybody's muted.
I'll second.
Okay, do we need a roll call vote on this?
Yes, Manager Crafton,
Yes,
Manager Duval,
Yes.
Manager Cook,
Yes.
Manager Pedersen,
Yes.
President Ziegler.
Yes,
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you.
okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rain and the spring.
See you next Tuesday. Was that what we agreed to?
Yes.
Yes,
All right.
for
See you then.
What time?
continuation of,
7 o'clock, Jill.
okay, thanks.
Good night, all.
Good
night,
night.
all right.